The town of Tellers Creek, Texas, was built on dust and determination, and it smelled of both. In the dry season, the dust was a fine, pale powder that coated everything: the lips of men, the hems of dresses, the sills of windows. In the wet season, it turned to a thick, greedy mud that clung to wagon wheels and boot heels with equal tenacity. Nora Voss knew the town by its smells more than its sights. For 3 years, she had known it from the back of Dalton's boarding house, from the steam-fogged window of a kitchen that was always too hot. She knew the sharp scent of lye soap on Monday mornings, the heavy smell of roasting beef on Sundays, the yeasty promise of baking bread every dawn. She was 24 years old, and for 3 years she had been a function, not a person. She was the cook, the source of the meals that appeared on exacting a long trestle table in the dining room at 7, at noon, and at 6, as reliable as the town clock, which was not very reliable at all. The men who ate her food, ranch hands, merchants, the occasional lawyer passing through, knew her work. They knew her pot roast had a richness that spoke of slow cooking, that her gravy was never lumpy, and that her apple pies had a crust that flaked just so. But they did not know her. They would not have recognized her on the street had she ever had cause to walk down its center in the light of day. Her world was the kitchen, the pantry, the small room upstairs with its narrow bed and single window that looked out onto an alley. She had become invisible in the way that useful women so often did. A pair of hands, a reliable stove, a predictable comfort. She had come to Tellers Creek after her parents had been taken by the fever, leaving her with nothing but a good name and a knowledge of how to stretch $1 and a side of beef. Mr. Dalton, a man whose kindness was as practical and unadorned as his establishment, had given her the position. He paid her a fair wage, saw that she was safe under his roof, and never once asked about the life she'd had before. He was not an unkind man, but he too saw her function first. It was the way of things. Nora accepted it. She did not rail against it. She did not possess the kind of spirit that wasted energy on things that could not be changed. Instead, she poured her life into her work. She found a quiet satisfaction in the rhythmic thump of a knife on a cutting board, in the precise alchemy of flour and fat and water, in the small, deep pleasure of seeing empty plates come back to her kitchen. It was a language of its own, this act of feeding people, a way of caring for them from a distance, without the need for words or names. Her biscuits, in particular, were her pride. They were light and layered, with a faint tang of buttermilk that cut through their richness. They were, she felt, the best thing she made. They were the most honest part of her. He came in on a Tuesday, a day when the special was chicken and dumplings. He was a cattle drover, that much was clear from the dust on his hat and the wear on his boots. He was not a boy, but not yet a man settled into the comfortable shape of middle age. There was a stillness about him that was different from the boisterous energy of the other men at the table. He sat at the far end, near the wall, and did not speak much. He ate with a slow, deliberate focus, as if the food on his plate was the only thing in the world that mattered. Nora watched him through the pass-through, the rectangular window between the kitchen and the dining room where she set the platters of food. It was her habit to watch the men eat. Not for thanks, for that was rare, but to gauge their appetites, to see what was favored and what was left behind. This man, he ate everything. He cleaned his plate of the chicken and the tender dumplings, mopped up the last of the gravy with a piece of cornbread, and then ate 3 of her biscuits with a slow, appreciative thoroughness. When he was finished, he brought his plate to the pass-through, a thing none of the other men ever did. They left their dishes on the table for the boy, Jimmy, to clear. The drover set his plate on the shelf. His hands were clean but calloused, the knuckles scarred. He looked directly toward the shadows of the kitchen. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and carried a rumble, like distant thunder. "That was the best meal I've had in a year of Sundays." Nora, startled by the direct address, shrank back from the opening. She murmured something that was not quite a word, a soft sound of acknowledgement. He did not seem to expect more. He simply nodded once, put on his hat, and left. She thought about it as she washed the dishes. Not the compliment itself, which was pleasant enough, but the way he had said it. He had looked toward the source. He had acknowledged the hands that had made the food, and his thank you had sounded like he meant it. It was a small thing, a stone dropped into the placid water of her days, but the ripples spread farther than she expected. She expected never to see him again. Drovers passed through. They were like the seasonal winds, a temporary presence that stirred the dust and then moved on. But he was there the next morning for breakfast. He took the same seat at the end of the table. The breakfast was ham, eggs, and the platters of her buttermilk biscuits. He ate his fill, and when Jimmy came around with the coffee pot, the drover stopped him. "Son," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the clatter of forks and conversation, "could you ask the cook for more of her biscuits?" Jimmy, a boy of 15 who was perpetually distracted, just nodded. "More biscuits? Sure." The drover shook his head slightly. "No, not just more biscuits from the warmer. I'm asking for her biscuits, the ones she makes." He paused. "If it's not too much trouble." In the kitchen, Nora froze, her hand hovering over a bowl of dough. She heard every word. Jimmy appeared at the pass-through, a confused look on his face. "Man out there wants more biscuits. Said to ask for yours specific." For 3 years they had been the house biscuits, or just biscuits. No one had ever made the distinction. No one had ever considered that they came from a specific person, from a pair of hands that might have a name. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she could not immediately name it. It was recognition. She took a fresh tray from the oven, the tops of the biscuits of perfect burnished gold. She arranged the 6 best ones on a clean plate, covered them with a napkin, and handed the plate to Jimmy herself. She did not look through the pass-through this time. She could not. She felt, for the first time in a long time, seen, and it made her shy. The man's name, she learned from the chatter, was Will Harte. His herd had been delivered to the railhead a few miles south. He had business in town, settling accounts at the bank. That should have taken a day, 2 at most. He was there for supper that night. And breakfast the next day. He came back for the noon meal on Thursday, and again for supper. By Friday, his continued presence at the table was no longer a simple fact but a question hanging in the air. He had no more cattle, no more accounts to settle. Yet there he sat, at the same table, eating his meals with that same quiet intensity. Nora found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. She began to time the final stages of her cooking to his arrival, ensuring the food he was served was the hottest, the freshest. She took a little more care with the plating, arranging the slices of roast beef just so, adding a sprig of parsley she grew in a pot on the back step. These were small, secret gestures, communications sent from her world into his, with no expectation of a reply. But he always replied, in his own way. With the clean plate, with the quiet, direct, "Thank you, ma'am," delivered to the pass-through window, and every morning, with his request for her biscuits. On Saturday, a week after he had first arrived, the question hanging in the air was finally given a voice. A rancher named Cobb, a man with a loud voice and a louder opinion on everything, looked down the table at Will Harte. "Harte," he boomed, gesturing with a fork, "your business in Teller's Creek must be mighty complicated." "Still here?" Will did not look up from his plate immediately. He chewed his mouthful of steak, swallowed, and took a sip of water. The table had gone quiet. The other men were watching, curious. "My business is my own, Cobb." Sure, Cobb said, unwilling to be put off. "It's just, you ain't the type to linger. A man like you, a good drover, is either on the trail or on his way to one. What's keeping you in this dusty town? Will Harte placed his fork and knife neatly beside his plate. He looked at Cobb, then his gaze swept over the other faces at the table. Men who had eaten Nora's food for months, for years. Men who took it for granted, as they took the rising of the sun for granted. He spoke plainly, his voice not loud but carrying to every corner of the room. I've eaten in cow camps from here to Kansas. I've eaten in fancy dining rooms in San Antonio. I've had chuck wagon stew that could float a horseshoe and biscuits hard enough to stop a bullet. He paused, and his eyes flickered toward the pass-through window, toward the shadows where he knew she was listening. I have never, he said with a quiet finality, eaten food that tasted like someone actually cared whether it was good or not. Until I came here. A profound silence fell over the dining room. It was a silence filled with the sudden, collective turning of a dozen minds. It was as if a lamp had been lit in a familiar room, revealing a piece of furniture that had been there all along, but never truly seen. The men looked at the pass-through. They looked at their own plates, as if seeing them for the first time. They were not just eating pot roast. They were eating her pot roast. Cobb grunted, taken aback. Another man cleared his throat. The conversation that resumed was more subdued, thoughtful. But the shift had happened. The spell of Nora's invisibility had been broken. From that day on, things were different. Men started bringing their plates to the pass-through. They started offering their own quiet thank yous. They began to refer to the cook not as a function, but as a person. Miss Voss makes a fine stew, one would say. Did you try Miss Voss's pie? Another would ask. The town, which had looked through Nora for 3 years, suddenly looked at her. When she made her weekly trip to the general store for supplies, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, tipped his hat. Morning, Miss Voss. Heard good things about your biscuits. Martha, his wife, smiled a genuine smile instead of the polite, vacant one she reserved for customers. Nora, she said, using her first name for the first time. Let me know if you need any of that special cinnamon from the back. It was unnerving. It was wonderful. It was terrifying. She had grown accustomed to the shelter of her invisibility, to the freedom of being unobserved. Now she felt the weight of their eyes, of their expectations. And it was all because of him. Because of Will Harte. He remained in town. He took a room at the boarding house, paying his way week by week. He did odd jobs, mending harnesses at the livery, helping to repair a collapsed section of fence for a farmer just outside of town. It was clear he was finding reasons to stay. And every day, he ate 3 meals at Dalton's, his presence a steady, quiet anchor at the end of the long table. One afternoon, Mr. Dalton came into her kitchen. He was a tall, stooped man with kind eyes that had seen too much of the world to be surprised by any of it. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her knead dough. Nora, he began. That man, Harte. He's a good worker. Honest. Yes, Mr. Dalton, she said, her focus on the dough beneath her hands. He's looking for something more permanent than day work. I have that piece of land up north of my own spread. Needs a lot of work. Fences are down, the cabin's barely standing. But the water is good. He paused. I was thinking of offering him a seasonal position, a ranch hand to get the place in order. It would keep him here through the winter at least. Nora's hands stilled on the dough. Through the winter. The words seemed to echo in the warm, flower-dusted air. Mr. Dalton pushed himself off the doorframe. You have a remarkable inability to see what's standing right in front of you, child. Or maybe you see it better than anyone. Town looks out for its own. He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. He's a good man, Nora. A solid man. But a man like that can be slow. Sometimes he needs a reason to stay put. I thought I'd provide one. He left her then, alone with the cooling dough and a heart that was beating far too fast. A reason to stay. Mr. Dalton was offering Will a reason to stay. But the real reason, she knew, was sitting at the table in the other room. The real reason was her. And that knowledge was a heavy, fragile thing. Could she trust it? A man who saw her so clearly through her cooking, through the one thing she was confident in, could he be trusted to see the rest of her just as plainly? The quiet parts, the uncertain parts, the parts of her that had been hidden away for so long she wasn't sure she remembered where they were. What if he tasted her biscuits but, upon knowing the baker, found her wanting? The risk of it felt immense, a chasm that threatened to swallow the small, safe world she had built for herself. That evening, after the supper dishes were washed and stacked, she took a bowl of peas out to the back porch to shell them. The sun was setting, painting the dusty sky in shades of rose and bruised purple. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. It was her favorite time of day, a time of quiet transition. She heard the screen door creak behind her. She did not have to turn to know it was him. She had become attuned to his presence, to the solid, steady way he moved. Will Harte did not speak at first. He came and sat on the top step, a few feet away from her stool. The silence between them was not awkward. It was full, like the silence between two people who have been traveling the same road for a long time without speaking. She continued to shell the peas, the pods making a soft splitting sound, the peas a gentle rattle as they hit the bottom of the tin bowl. "Mr. Dalton offered me a job today," he said finally, his voice pitched low. Nora's fingers paused over a pod. "I heard. It's good work. A chance to put down some roots. For a season, anyway." He looked out at the fading light, at the long, deep shadows stretching across the yard. A man gets tired of the trail, the dust, the loneliness of it. She waited. She knew there was more. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. It was not her place. Or perhaps, she thought, it was. Perhaps it was time she claimed a place for herself. "I've been thinking," he said, turning his hat over and over in his hands, "about why I stayed. Cobb was right. It wasn't for any business in town." He looked at her then, his gaze as direct and honest as it had been that first day. "It was the biscuits, at first. That's the truth of it." A small smile touched her lips. "They're good biscuits." "They are," he agreed, a corresponding smile in his eyes. "But it wasn't just that they sue. They were good. It was how they were good. Like you said something with them. Something I hadn't heard before." He took a breath. "I kept coming back, thinking I was just coming back for the food. But I wasn't. I was coming back to be near the person who made it." He fell silent, and the weight of his unspoken question settled between them. He was a man of action, not of pretty words. He had laid out the facts as he saw them. He had made his case, plain and unadorned. Now he was waiting for a verdict. Nora set the bowl of peas on the porch beside her. She folded her hands in her lap, the skin rough and chapped from work, but the gesture was one of composure, not nervousness. She had been invisible for so long. To be seen this clearly, this deeply, was a blinding light after years in shadow. She could retreat into the safety of the kitchen, or she could step out into the sun. She chose the sun. "When Mr. Dalton told me he was going to offer you the job," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I was afraid." He looked pained. "Afraid of me?" "No," she said quickly. "Never of you. I was afraid of what it meant, that you might stay." She met his eyes. "And then I was afraid that you might not." She took a small, shaky breath, the bravest one of her life. "When I heard your footsteps on the porch just now, I was hoping it would be you. I was hoping you'd come to tell me you were staying." The relief that washed over his face was profound. It smoothed the worried lines around his eyes and softened the set of his jaw. He let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding since he sat down. "Nora," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was a kind of music. "I'm a slow man. Mr. Dalton says so, and he's right. It takes me a while to see things plain. But I see this. I see you." He stood up and took a step toward her, then stopped, as if unsure of the protocol for such a moment. He was a man more comfortable with branding irons and bridles than with the delicate architecture of a woman's heart. He settled for honesty. It was his native tongue. "I would like to take Mr. Dalton's offer," he said, his voice gaining a new, solid confidence. "I would like to stay in Teller's Creek, and I would like to stay, Nora Voss, as your husband." He waited. He had made his declaration. It was simple. It was direct. It was the most beautiful speech she had ever heard. She looked up at this quiet, steady man, this drover who had seen past her function to her substance. He had not offered her poetry or promises of a grand life. He had offered her something far more valuable. He had offered her himself, his presence, his future. He had offered her a place at his table for all the meals to come. "It took you long enough, Will Harte," she said, and the smile that broke across her face was like the dawn. Their courtship was as practical and unadorned as their declaration. It consisted of shared work and quiet conversations. He spent his days at the Dalton property, mending fences under the hot Texas sun, and his evenings on her back porch, helping her string beans or listening to her talk about her day. On Sundays, they walked together after church services, their steps falling into a comfortable rhythm. He learned that her favorite color was the pale blue of the prairie sky just before sunrise. She learned that he was quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he only spoke when he had something that was worth saying. The town watched and approved. It felt right. The steady man and the capable woman. They were two parts of a whole that no one had thought to put together until he had asked for more biscuits. Their union seemed as natural and necessary as rain after a long drought. They were married 2 months later, on a bright Saturday in October. The ceremony was held in the small clapboard church, attended by Mr. Dalton, the Hendersons from the general store, and a handful of the more respectable boarders. Nora wore a simple dress of dark blue cotton, the color he loved. She had made it herself. Will wore a suit that was slightly too tight in the shoulders, a testament to a life of physical labor. He looked solid and dependable and nervous. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Will did not kiss her with fiery passion. He leaned down and placed a gentle, firm kiss on her lips that was a promise. A promise of steadfastness. A promise of a shared life, built with honest work and quiet care. Afterward, there was a supper back at the boarding house. Nora had, of course, cooked it herself, with the help of Martha Henderson. There was roast chicken and potatoes, green beans and gravy. And on a platter in the center of the table, piled high and golden brown, was a mountain of her buttermilk biscuits. Will ate 3 of them, his eyes smiling at her over the rim of his water glass. 5 years passed. The dust of Teller's Creek still blew, and the seasons still turned with their relentless rhythm. But the world had changed for Nora and Will Harte. The piece of land Mr. Dalton had given them to manage had become their own, purchased with 2 years of Will's wages and Nora's carefully saved earnings. The cabin that had been barely standing was now a snug, sturdy home with a wide porch and blue-painted shutters. The fences were strong, and the fields held a small but growing herd of cattle that bore Will's brand. One evening in late summer, Nora stood on that porch, wiping her hands on her apron. 2 children, a boy of 4 with his father's quiet eyes and a girl of 2 with her mother's determined chin, played in the yard, their laughter mixing with the chirping of crickets. The sky was awash with the soft colors of twilight. She saw him coming from the fields, a silhouette against the setting sun, moving with the same steady, unhurried pace she had first noticed in the dining room of Dalton's boarding house. He was no longer the lean drover, but a settled rancher, his shoulders broader, his hands more calloused. But he was still the same man, still solid, still hers. He came up the steps, his boots making a familiar, comforting sound on the wood. He swept off his hat and bent to kiss her, his lips tasting of sun and honest sweat. "Smells good," he said, his arm settling around her waist. "Pot roast," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I made some biscuits." He smiled, a deep, easy smile that was just for her. "My favorite." They stood there for a long moment, watching their children play as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The life they had built was not an easy one. It was a life of hard work, of early mornings and late nights, of droughts and worries. But it was a good life. It was a shared life. It was a life that had been built on a foundation of mutual respect, a recognition that began with a simple plate of food, an acknowledgement of the care that had gone into its making. "You know," Will said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "I was thinking today about that first week in Teller's Creek." "Were you?" she murmured, content in his embrace. "I was. Thinking about how slow I was, how I almost rode right on out of town, almost missed everything." He tightened his arm around her. "Thank God for your biscuits, Nora." She laughed, a soft, happy sound. "And thank God you were hungry, Will." It was true. A man's hunger and a woman's care. On such simple things, a whole world could be built. A world of warmth and light, a home carved out of the dust, a love that was as reliable and nourishing as fresh-baked bread. It was more than enough. It was everything.